It started with the humming. Mom always hummed, little cheerful tunes while she cooked or cleaned. But one day, the melodies changed. They were low and uneven, off-key in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "Mum, what are you humming?" I asked one evening, as she stirred spaghetti sauce on the stove. She paused, the ladle hovering mid-air, and turned toward me with a smile that looked strained. "Humming?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but there was something about her tone, too smooth, too deliberate. "Yeah," I said, laughing nervously. "It was weird, like, not you." Her smile faltered for a moment, and for a split second her face went blank, like she wasn't sure how to react. Then she laughed, a hollow, brittle sound. "Oh, sweetheart, you're so silly." The conversation felt wrong, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to notice. The changes crept in, subtle as a whisper, until they became impossible to ignore. She stopped drinking her morning coffee, something that had once defined her routine as much as breathing. "It doesn't taste right anymore," she murmured one morning, her voice hollow, her words brittle like dry leaves skittering on pavement. She didn't sound disappointed or even tired, just empty, as though some essential part of her had been drained away. Her skin lost its warmth, turning pale and waxy, almost translucent in certain lights. Beneath the surface, a network of veins seemed to shimmer faintly, as delicate and eerie as spider silk. Her hair began to come out in brittle, uneven tufts, clogging the shower drain. Her once vibrant locks reduced to something lifeless and coarse. Then the forgetting started. At first it was small, almost laughable, a misplaced set of keys or a phone left in the fridge, but it unraveled quickly. My friends' names became a challenge, their faces triggering only a vague flicker of recognition. Conversations we'd had hours earlier slipped away like sand through her fingers. Even the date of her own birthday left her fumbling. "I'm just tired," she'd explain, her lips curving into a smile that didn't belong to her. Too tight, too strained, like a mask hastily pulled into place. The expression lingered a fraction too long, as if she were struggling to remember how emotions should look. But it wasn't just her memory. It was the way she moved. Her gestures lost their fluidity, becoming jerky, unnatural. Every step she took seemed deliberate, mechanical, as though she were consciously thinking through each muscle and joint. Watching her walk felt like watching a marionette, her movements bound by invisible strings. Then there was that night. I was walking past the bathroom when I noticed the door ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out into the hallway. Something made me stop. She was inside, standing before the mirror, her shoulders stiff, unnaturally still. "I love you, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice low and rasping, each word dragged out like something being pulled through glass shards. She repeated it again and again. "I love you, sweetheart. I love you, sweetheart." The words were mechanical, each iteration more detached, less human. Her lips moved, but there was something off, a strange stiffness in their rhythm, a slight lag, as if her mouth and voice weren't entirely synchronized. And her reflection, it didn't follow her perfectly. It lagged, like it hesitated to mirror her movements, catching up just a fraction of a second too late. I froze in the doorway, my breath caught in my chest. "Mum?" I called softly, my voice trembling. Her head jerked toward me, snapping around so fast it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. For a moment, her face was utterly blank, like a sheet of paper wiped clean of emotion, her features slack and alien. Then her eyes glinted, impossibly dark, the faint gleam of something that wasn't entirely human flickering in their depths. And then that smile. It spread across her face slowly, unnervingly fluid, the motion pulling her skin tight over her cheekbones until it looked stretched to the brink. Her teeth bared, too perfect, too uniform, as if they weren't hers at all. "Just getting ready for bed," she whispered, her voice almost sing-song, the light in her eyes too sharp, too knowing. The bathroom light flickered, the glow stuttering like a failing heartbeat. The night after that, I woke to a sound that pulled me out of sleep like a hook dragging me upward. Scratching. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe branches brushing against the side of the house. But as the sound deepened, growing more deliberate, I realized it wasn't outside. It was coming from her room. My chest tightened as I slid out of bed, the cool floor biting at my bare feet. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a shout in the silence as I crept down the hallway. The sound of scratching growing louder, sharper, almost methodical. I reached her door, heart hammering against my ribs, and pushed it open just a crack. The light from the hallway spilled in, catching her silhouette. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back ramrod straight, her head tilted slightly down as if studying the floor. Her hands gripped the bedpost with a force that turned her knuckles bone white. Her nails, those jagged, brittle nails, dragged against the wood in slow, rhythmic strokes. Each scrape left deep grooves behind, carving the post as though it were soft clay. "Mom?" I whispered, the word barely escaping my throat. She froze. Her head twitched, just slightly, just enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. But she didn't turn around. Her fingers stilled for a moment, hovering inches above the marred surface of the bedpost. "Go back to bed," she said, her voice flat, empty, like the hollow ring of wind through an abandoned building. Something in me screamed to leave, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until her fingers began twitching again. Her nails scraped the wood, slower this time, deliberate, as though she were waiting for me to leave. I stumbled back, my hand fumbling for the doorknob. The door slammed shut behind me, louder than I intended, and for a brief, fragile moment, the scratching stopped. I had barely taken 3 steps when it resumed. Steadier now, faster, as though it had been waiting for me to leave. Somehow, I fell asleep that night. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the constant weight of dread, or perhaps some part of me simply shut down to cope. But the relief was short-lived. I woke around 3 a.m. to whispers. They seeped into the room like tendrils of smoke, curling into my ears, low and guttural, almost hungry. The words slithered in a language I couldn't understand, each syllable scraping at the edges of my mind, prying into places it didn't belong. I clutched the blanket tighter, my breath shallow, frozen in the suffocating stillness. Then the sound came. The creak of my door opening split the silence, slow and deliberate, the groan of the hinges sharp and jagged, like fingernails dragged across glass. My heart stopped. She didn't walk in. She crawled. No, she slithered. Her movements were jagged, wrong like the spasms of a broken marionette whose strings were being yanked by unsteady hands. Limbs bent at grotesque, impossible angles, snapping audibly with each shift. Her head lolled to one side, tilted too far. So far it seemed her neck would snap under the weight. Shadows clung to her body, unnaturally thick, wrapping around her like living things. They pulsed and shifted with her, as though tethered to her very being. "Sweetheart," she rasped. Her voice was a serrated whisper, raw and distorted, grinding against the inside of my skull. "Why don't we spend some time together?" She stepped, or dragged closer, and her face emerged from the shadows. It wasn't her face. Her skin, pale and sickly, looked stretched to its limit, barely clinging to the bones beneath. It wasn't smooth but rough, speckled with tiny, iridescent scales that glinted like the hide of some vile serpent. Her features twitched and spasmed, struggling to hold the illusion of something human but failing. Her eyes were the worst. They weren't eyes at all, just twin voids of blackness, endless and hungry. There were no pupils, no whites, no light, just pits of darkness that seemed to pull everything in, including my breath and my sanity. Her eyelids flickered with an unsettling, rapid twitch, as though fighting against some unseen force. And her mouth, God, her mouth. Her lips were thin, stretched back far too wide in a grotesque mockery of a smile, revealing teeth that couldn't belong to anything living. They were jagged, uneven, some jutting out too far, others cracked or splintered. A sickly yellow sheen coated their surface, and they gleamed with a wetness that made my stomach churn. They looked like they could tear through bone without hesitation, their malice shimmering in the dim light. The air between us grew thick, foul. Her breath hit me in waves, rancid, carrying the stench of old ash, rot, and something deeper, something that reeked of decay and the grave. It wrapped around me, suffocating, dragging me into a waking nightmare. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me, pinned down by a terror so profound it felt alive. My limbs were heavy, weighted with dread, as if some unseen force pressed against my chest. Her claw-like fingers reached out, skeletal and impossibly long, tipped with nails that glinted like shards of glass. They hovered inches from my face before brushing against my forehead. The touch burned like ice, sending a ripple of terror through my entire being. "Let's play," she whispered, the words slithering over me like a death knell. The world shifted. In an instant, I wasn't in my room anymore. I saw her, my real mom. She was bound in chains, her body trembling, frail and gaunt, as if it had been drained of life. Her hair hung in tangled, matted clumps, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up slowly, and when her eyes met mine, they were filled with sheer, unfiltered terror. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her head jerked upright, panic flooding her expression. "Run!" she screamed, her voice raw and broken, desperation tearing through every syllable. "It's too late for me. Run! They're coming for you next." Behind her the shadows came alive. They coiled and writhed, twisting into clawed hands that stretched toward me, hungry and unrelenting. The vision shattered like glass, and I was back in my room. The thing wearing my mother's face loomed over me, impossibly close. Her clawed fingers grazed my cheek, the touch as cold as death. Her twisted smile widened, impossibly inhuman. "It's your turn now, sweetheart," she hissed. The shadows in the room began to stir, writhing and twisting unnaturally, creeping toward me with a dreadful inevitability. Her laughter filled the air, sharp and piercing, echoing like a chorus of madness. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in, the truth hit me like ice in my veins. There was no one left to save me.